Did your family walk on eggshells or explode without warning?
It happened at Easter lunch, right in the middle of Megan pacing through her usual greatest hits about clients who love her vision and employees who are lucky to have a boss who doesn't micromanage. When she looked at me with that practiced kindness people use when they want to humiliate you while sounding supportive and said, "Congrats on your little hobby." And I felt that old heat in my chest that always shows up when someone reduces years of effort to something you do between folding laundry and listening to podcasts, but before I could swallow or answer or even find the fake smile I keep for family gatherings, my grandpa leaned forward, placed both hands on the table like a judge who has heard enough nonsense for one lifetime, and said, "Funny. That hobby just bought her company's office building," and then everything inside that room stopped moving, like even the air had the sense to hold itself in place and wait to see who would speak first. I wish I could tell you that I looked victorious or clever or even composed, yet the truth is that I just stared at my plate and felt the smallest laugh push up from somewhere I normally keep locked. Because it wasn't a joke and it wasn't a boast and it wasn't meant to be cruel, it was simply the first time anyone in that family said out loud what I had been working toward in quiet for years. And hearing it from him and not from me made it land in a way that no speech or slideshow or bank statement ever could, and I could feel every single person at that table run through the same calculation at the same time. The one where you try to understand how the person you took lightly might have been playing a different game with different rules that you never bothered to learn because you were too busy winning at your own. Megan laughed first, because of course she did, and she said, "Very funny, Dad," which was wrong in two ways because he is not her father and also because nothing about his face said funny. And then she looked at me with that puzzled expression that is not actually curiosity, it is ownership. It is the expectation that if there is any new information in my life it will be handed over to her for review and approval, and she said, "What is he talking about, Em?" And I said, "Let's eat while it's warm." Which was not a dodge so much as a decision, because I had promised myself I would not be the one to say it first. Not because I am shy or because I wanted to hoard the moment, but because I understand that privilege lives in the mouth that announces things. And I wanted the announcement to come from someone who had watched me start and fail and try again without the family applause that has always been saved for my sister's milestones. If I sound bitter, I am not, or at least not in the way people mean when they say the word like it is a poison, because what I feel is closer to clarity. The kind that arrives after you have spent years translating your own worth into metrics other people can read. And then one afternoon you realize you no longer need a translator because the numbers make sense to you and the quiet makes sense to you and your choices make sense to you. And once you have that, the rest is noise, even if the noise is loud and shared across a long table with bowls of food and old stories and cutting remarks delivered with a smile. Megan has always liked to tell me how the world works, which is funny when you think about it, because she is not exactly a villain. She is not even a bad person. She is just a person who believes in hierarchies the way other people believe in vitamins. One a day keeps the anxiety away, and in her hierarchy a hobby is something soft and feminine and small, something you do to keep yourself occupied while real adults are out winning contracts and hiring teams and talking to their bankers, and the fact that I chose not to make noise while I built what I built looked to her like a confession of smallness rather than a strategy, which is fine, because strategies do not require her approval. They require time and patience and a willingness to be underestimated over and over until the underestimation becomes useful. So when Grandpa said the line, the one that cracked the room in half, I let it sit, and the silence worked for me the way silence works for surgeons and poker players and anyone who has ever waited for the other side to blink first. And in that pause I thought about the first building I walked into with a tape measure and a notebook and a stomach full of nerves, and I thought about the way Megan laughed when I said I liked old commercial spaces because they were honest about their flaws, and I remembered every weekend I spent scraping away at something ugly so it could earn its keep, and I felt this deep, private satisfaction that the only person who really needed to understand me already did. Because he had driven me to look at my first property and said, "Buy what other people overlook, then make it useful. That is where the value hides." Megan tried again, this time with an edge, because when charm fails she gets sharp, and she said, What kind of joke are we making here? Because my company's landlord is a fund, and they are not in the business of selling to hobbyists. And she smiled at the word as if saying it loudly would shrink me back to size, and I said, "It is not a joke," and then I took a sip of water and changed the subject to the deviled eggs, which made Uncle Ray snort into his napkin and made my mother glare at me for being difficult, and that was fine too, because there is a cost to not performing your assigned role, and I have been paying it long enough to stop asking for change. If you are waiting for me to say I felt guilty, I did not. And if you are waiting for me to say I wanted to teach her a lesson, I did not want that either, because lessons imply I owe her a curriculum and a set of outcomes, and I owe her nothing but clarity. And clarity sometimes looks like a sentence dropped in the middle of lunch that rearranges the furniture inside your head. And if that sounds cold, then maybe you have never stood in a lobby you own and watched a tenant walk by without recognizing that the building answers to your decisions now, not theirs, and you realize how powerful silence can be when it is attached to something real. I kept thinking, do not rush it, do not rescue her, do not fill the quiet with explanations, because explanations are a kind of apology, and if there is one thing I am done apologizing for, it is the size of my life, and I had a plan. Not for drama at the table, not for a speech or a mic drop, but for something that would settle into her bones over time the way a truth does when it is tied to bills and leases and calendars, and all the things adults cannot ignore no matter how stubborn they feel. And that plan required me to stay still, to let her wonder, to let her check her phone later and see the email she had missed, the one that would confirm what Grandpa had said without a single exclamation mark. My grandpa reached for my hand under the table for just a second and gave it one squeeze, and in that small gesture I felt seen in a way that did not require anyone else's approval, and it settled me. And I ate my food and listened to the conversation stumble forward, and I knew that after dessert Megan would excuse herself to make a call and then another. And by evening she would be asking more specific questions about shell companies and ownership records, and whether I was playing some kind of prank, and I would answer none of them until I was ready, because this was not about humiliating her in public, it was about resetting the story of who I am in a way that could not be argued with. I am going to tell you exactly how I did it, how the opportunity showed up, how I moved fast without leaving fingerprints, and why I told only one person in the family and chose him on purpose. But before I do, I need you to understand the rule that has guided me since the first time I was laughed at for thinking too big, which is simple and not pretty, and it goes like this. If someone insists on calling your work a hobby, let them. Because a hobby is invisible until it owns the room you are sitting in, and by the time they notice, you will not need their applause, you will need only their signature at the bottom of a very ordinary document, and that is exactly where this is headed. Because the day I saw the first sign that her building might be changing hands, I made a choice Megan still does not know how to forgive. If you want to understand why that one sentence from my grandpa landed like a verdict, you have to know how long I let everyone treat my work like a side activity while I quietly learned the parts nobody posts about. The unglamorous steps like reading leases until my eyes hurt, calling city clerks to ask what could and could not be changed without triggering inspections that would turn a budget inside out, arguing with electricians who swore a panel could carry one more tenant when the permit file said otherwise, and doing that over and over until I could see where the value hid in plain sight, which is usually in the space between what a seller is tired of dealing with and what a tenant needs, but has stopped asking for because they assume no one will bother, and once you see that gap you start to think in a different way. Not in speeches or announcements, but in small, decisive moves that add up when nobody is watching because nobody believes the small moves matter. My so-called hobby started with a single awkward office condo that smelled like toner and old carpet, and yes, I paid too much for it, and yes, I underestimated how long it would sit empty after I fixed the obvious stuff. And I still remember Megan telling me that she was happy for me in the same tone people use when a child sells lemonade on a cold day. Because to her the test of seriousness is how many people you have working under you and how often you get to say the word boardroom, while to me, the test is whether the math works without drama, and after that first clumsy purchase I learned to buy quieter and better, to keep my lender relationships tidy, to say no to spaces that needed romance instead of repairs. and to only talk about a deal once it was earning its keep, which meant the family never really saw the ramp. They just saw me keep showing up to holidays without slides or trophies and assumed that meant nothing was growing. So when the rumor reached me that the owner of Megan's building wanted out, it did not feel like fate or a movie twist. It felt like an email from a broker who had finally convinced a tired landlord to test the market because the interest rate on his loan was coming due soon and the building had a couple of nagging issues he did not want to fund. And if you are wondering how I heard about it, the answer is not magic. It is that I answer my phone when certain people call and I do not waste their time when I am not a buyer, which means they keep calling. And this broker said he had a confidential whisper, older owner, clean rent roll, one anchor tenant that always paid on time, a few deferred maintenance items that would scare off retail-only buyers, and a seller who wanted a clean close before summer. And while he was listing the tenants, I felt my throat go tight because there it was, Megan's company suite, the one with her ridiculous inspirational slogan on the entry wall, the space. That had been her stage for years. I did not tell him I knew the anchor tenant by blood, because information like that distorts the process. It makes people nosy. It pulls in more eyes than I wanted, so I asked for the financials and the leases like any other buyer would. And I sent the package to my attorney, a woman who does not mind being the bad cop and who had warned me, more than once, that mixing family with business is like mixing bleach and vinegar, dramatic and toxic, and I told her I was not mixing anything. I was simply considering an asset that fit my box, and she said then we will do it by the book, which starts with an entity that does not have your name stamped across it like a gift tag, and it continues with an offer letter that is boring, tight, and fast. While she formed the holding company and my lender confirmed they liked the numbers, I walked myself through the risks like I always do, not the dramatic ones people love to gossip about, but the practical ones that break deals. Like whether the roof had a real remaining life or just a hopeful estimate, whether the leases were triple net as stated or sneaking in little owner obligations that would chew the margin, whether any tenant had an early termination right that would turn the cash flow into a guess, and whether buying this specific building would hand me power I did not want, because owning a thing your sister believes she deserves to control will make every future holiday feel like a performance review. And I had to be honest with myself that I could live with that, so I went line by line through the documents and decided that I could. My attorney handed me a draft offer that was as plain as toast, and I loved it, because there is a time for flair and there is a time for clean lines. And we offered a price a little under ask with a strong earnest deposit and a timeline that would make a tired seller breathe easier, and we proposed to waive financing contingencies because I had a bridge lined up against the equity I had built, which is the boring reward of saying no to vacations you cannot afford and yes to roofs you cannot ignore. And we set the inspection period short because I already had the inspectors booked under a different name, and when I hit send I felt the slow, steady adrenaline I only get when the next move is no longer about talk. It is about whether my prep was good enough to hold. Not 2 hours after that, Megan called me to ask if I could help her friend's son find a place for a pop-up shop, and I said I would keep an eye out, and she said, "You are sweet," and then she slipped in the usual jab about my projects, and how cute it was that I still liked to tinker with old spaces, and I listened without reacting because there is no point in arguing with a story someone needs to believe about you, and while she talked I watched the email window on my laptop refresh, and when the broker's name appeared my mouth went dry, and I let her finish her thought about leadership and culture and how growth requires tough decisions, and I said, "You are not wrong," and we hung up, and I opened the email and saw the line that matters more than any speech, which is that the seller had accepted the terms, pending execution of the purchase and sale agreement to be circulated by close of business. I wired the earnest money the next morning and scheduled the building walkthrough for the following week, and because I am not reckless, I also reviewed her company's lease 3 more times to confirm there were no poison pills that would make this petty or stupid. And there were none, just the usual renewal options and annual bumps and maintenance responsibilities that had been written by someone who thought like I think, which is why this would work, and I told exactly one person in the Family what I was doing, the same one who would later say the line that froze the table, because I wanted one ally who understood both the arithmetic and the history, and he said, if you are sure you can carry it if she leaves, do it, and I said I was sure. And he said then stop explaining it to me and go close. You want revenge in this chapter, and I will tell you what it looked like, because it was not loud and it was not cruel. It was me instructing my attorney to keep my name out of every document that did not legally require it. It was me asking the broker to direct all tenant communications through the property manager after closing, and it was me choosing a perfectly ordinary holding company name that would never ring a bell at a family table, so that when the sale recorded and the tenants received the change of ownership letter with their next rent invoice, Megan would toss it to her assistant like any other piece of boring mail, and she would not realize until much later that the new landlord's signature, the one she did not bother to read, led back to me. And because timing is a character in any plan whether you admit it or not, the building closed a few days before Easter. The property manager queued the notices, and I sat with a cup of coffee the night before lunch and watched the emails go out to every tenant, including the one with my sister's logo in the footer, and then I put my phone face down and let the machine do its work, knowing that morning would bring either nothing at all or a call I had been preparing to take, and that is where I will leave you, because as I walked into Easter lunch and saw my sister already holding court with her favorite audience, my phone buzzed once in my bag with a message from a number I recognized from her office, and I did not open it yet, because it is always better to let curiosity ripen before you cut it. The thing about buying something that belongs, at least emotionally, to a person who has spent years telling you where you do and do not belong, is that you cannot afford even a single sloppy move. So while the seller's broker was congratulating himself for getting a clean offer, and my lender was lining up the appraisal and the property condition report, I was doing the most boring and therefore most important work of my life, which meant letting my attorney build a wall of ordinary between me and the asset, a plain holding company with a plain manager and a mailing address that would make a mail carrier yawn, and then letting her speak for me in every conversation where a careless word could later become a breadcrumb. Because anonymity is not about drama or secrecy, it is about not creating any unnecessary details for other people to connect when they finally bother to look. There was a hiccup right away, not a disaster, but one of those things that turns your stomach until you remind yourself that the documents are the story. And in this case, the story was a question about a minor code compliance item on the fire system that had been in process for too long to trust, and I did what I always do when confronted with a maybe that could hurt, which is call the inspector who has no stake in my deal and ask what, exactly, would make him sign off without turning it into an expensive crusade. And when he laid out the steps, I added the cost to my mental pile and moved on, because drama only grows when you insist the world be neater than it is, and I have learned to make peace with messes as long as they are priced correctly. The title report brought another little gift in the form of an ancient easement nobody had bothered to clear because it never blocked anything practical, which made the seller's attorney dismiss it as trivia and made mine look at me over her glasses and say, "Trivia is what gets you sued when someone suddenly cares." So we drafted a tidy little cure requirement and refused to budge, and the seller, who wanted his clean close before summer like he had said, chose the path of least resistance and fixed it, which is exactly what you get when you stay boring and patient while other people try to move faster than the paperwork allows. In the background, the human part of the story kept doing what humans do, which is to fill in silence with their own favorite assumptions. So Megan called me one afternoon while I was reviewing estoppel certificates to ask if I was free to help her pick a contractor for a cosmetic refresh in their lobby, because a client was coming to town and the space needed, in her words, adult energy. And I said I could send a couple of names, and she laughed and said, "That would be adorable, send me your little guys and I will pass them along to my facilities lead." And I said nothing because if I had opened my mouth I might have said something I would later regret. And instead I forwarded 2 solid vendors to a generic address at her company and returned to the 2 questions that truly mattered, which were whether every tenant acknowledged the critical bits of their lease and whether any of those acknowledgments hid time bombs that would force me into a fire drill before I had my arms around the building. We were not the only buyer, of course, because decent buildings with decent tenants do not linger, and there was an offer from a small fund that had more appetite for leverage than I did and a habit of dressing up their bids with pretty language. And I felt that old spike of imposter syndrome until my attorney reminded me that sellers like certainty more than they like adjectives. So we hardened the deposit sooner than was comfortable and agreed to a timeline that would let the seller exhale. And I swallowed my discomfort because this was one of those moments where the risk was not reckless, it was earned, and the math said I could carry the building even if the anchor tenant, meaning my sister, moved out at the first legal chance, which she would threaten to do the first time she felt cornered. And knowing that and buying anyway was the difference between revenge that is loud and stupid and revenge that is quiet and impossible to unwind. When the appraisal came in right where I needed it and the environmental came back clean enough that I did not have to budget for surprises with scary acronyms, I felt the first real wave of relief, and then, predictably, the fund tried to jump the line with a tiny price bump and a lot of talk about track record, and the seller, who had already tasted the ease of a quick close, stayed with us because we were not singing, we were signing. And the purchase and sale agreement hit my inbox with a signature block that would not mean anything to anyone who had not already done the digging, and that was the point, because I wanted Megan to live inside the version of the story where the landlord was faceless and boring for as long as possible. I made one policy decision before closing that I will admit felt like a small, private clapback even though it was rational on its own merits, which was to standardize late fees and compliance documentation across tenants on a schedule the previous owner had let slide. Not because I wanted to nickel and dime anyone, but because consistency keeps you out of petty arguments. And also because I knew my sister's team had a habit of treating deadlines like suggestions, and there was a stubborn part of me that wanted her to feel, in a way that did not require a single raised voice, that the building no longer bent to her calendar, and I smiled when my property manager, who had no idea about the family connection, told me she expected a little pushback from that one tenant that always cut it close, and I said, send the same letter to everyone and let the paper do the heavy lifting. We closed a handful of days before Easter, exactly as planned, without a toast or a photo or any announcement that would make me look like the kind of person who needs confetti to believe her own success. And I let the property manager send the change of ownership notices by email and by mail like clockwork, and then I watched my phone light up with 2 unread messages from a number I recognized as Megan's assistant, which I did not open because I have learned that you do not get the payoff you want if you rush the moment that is trying to arrive on its own, and I set the phone on silent and drove to my grandfather's house with the polite neutrality of someone who is going to a normal family lunch, even though both of us knew there was nothing normal about what was about to happen. At the table, before the comment and before the line that cut through the room, there was a small beat where Megan leaned toward me and said she had a hilarious email to show me from a new landlord who clearly did not understand how things worked. And I said I would love to hear it after we ate because I was curious how adults handled confusion these days, and she rolled her eyes in a way that told me she had not connected any dots yet, which was exactly where I wanted her, and I could feel my grandfather's attention settle on me the way it does when he senses I am choosing restraint over satisfaction, and I took a breath and reminded myself that revenge that lasts is the kind you do not have to explain even once. What happened next you already know from the way it landed in the room, but what you do not know is that right before she spoke her little line about my hobby and right before he answered with the sentence that rearranged everyone's understanding of me, my phone buzzed again with a voicemail that I would only listen to hours later, and in that voicemail her assistant would ask, with more politeness than she usually gave me, if I could possibly connect her to someone at the new management company because they were asking for updated certificates and a small adjustment to how rent was remitted, which is to say that the first tiny consequence of years of being underestimated had already arrived, and I had not even had to lift a finger. When the wire for the first month's rent landed in the new account and the memo line showed the name of Megan's company spelled out the way she insists everyone spell it, I did not cheer or screenshot or send a single message. I just stared at the confirmation and felt the kind of steadiness that comes when the story you have been telling yourself in private starts putting on shoes and walking around in the real world, because there is something different about money that arrives without your asking and without any apology, and it was not about the amount so much as about the direction, which had been flowing one way for years in our family's conversations, and was now flowing the other way in a way no one could talk over or explain away with charm. I had told my property manager to handle every interaction with the same neutral tone she uses with everyone, and to ignore any attempts by tenants to run around her and reach whoever they thought was really in charge. Because the whole point of setting this up through a holding company was not to play cat and mouse, but to set rules that did not require me to defend them, and she did exactly that. Which meant that when Megan's assistant replied to the change of ownership email with a complaint about the updated certificates and the new due date format, she got the same polite response every other tenant got, a short outline of what the lease already required, the forms attached, a calendar invite with a deadline, and a note that questions could be addressed through the portal, which is the kind of system Megan always says she loves when she is the one imposing it on other people. I decided to tell my grandfather everything before Easter, not because I needed an ally in a fight, but because I wanted one person at the table who knew that staying calm was not me being passive. It was me choosing the kind of win that would not poison me later. And when I explained the structure and the closing and the plan for quiet management, he did not clap or give a speech. He just asked me the question that matters, whether I could live with the possibility that Megan would try to break the lease at the first legal chance, just to prove she was not under anyone's thumb, and I said I could live with it because I had run the numbers and I had backup tenants lined up and I had learned to separate family peace from business decisions. And he nodded once, the way he does when he thinks I am not hiding from the hard part, and he said he would follow my lead at lunch. There were little moments in those days before Easter that felt like private victories I did not need to share to enjoy, like approving a simple invoice for janitorial upgrades that the old owner had avoided for too long, knowing it would make the hallways cleaner and make complaints drop across the building, and like rejecting a last-minute request from one of the smaller tenants to paint a wall a color that would have made the space harder to lease later. And most of all, like reading an email thread where Megan's team pushed back on the standardized late fee policy with the same breezy confidence they have always used, only to receive a calm reply quoting the lease they had signed years ago, and seeing their tone shift from confident to professional to compliant within 3 exchanges without anyone ever using my name. I also made a choice I knew would irritate her more than she would admit, which was to schedule the annual sprinkler test for the week after Easter and insist, through my manager, that all suites comply within the given window. Because the building had been sliding those tests around to accommodate the loudest voices, and I wanted that habit to stop, and the timing mattered because Megan had a small event that week and would normally demand exceptions, and the quiet point I wanted to make was that the building was not her back office anymore. It was a shared asset with shared responsibilities, and the fastest way to reset that expectation was through a practical, non-negotiable maintenance item everyone else would accept without a fit. And while it may sound petty, it was not. It was a boundary made of policy instead of attitude. On the morning of Easter, my phone held 2 unread messages from her assistant. One asking for a contact above the property manager to escalate a question about vendor access, and one asking whether the late fee policy had any flexibility for longtime tenants with a flawless record. And I left both unread because I had decided that my presence as the unseen owner belonged in bank statements and policy enforcement, not in inbox fights, and I drove to lunch with the kind of careful self-control that keeps you from saying the thing that would be satisfying for 10 seconds and messy for 10 months. And when I walked into the kitchen and saw my grandfather rinsing a plate, he gave me a look that said he trusted me to keep my footing. And I felt something in my shoulders loosen, because sometimes trust is better than applause. Megan arrived performing confidence the way she always does, with too much volume and a list of small wins that are meant to add up to a big picture of someone who is in charge. And when she pointed at a chair for me to take as if seating charts had anything to do with age in our family, I just sat where I wanted and watched her complain about the new landlord to our mother. using the same half-jokes she uses when she wants everyone to nod along and agree that she is the star and the rest of us are supporting characters, and I kept my face neutral and my voice kind because I was not here to take anything away from her. I was here to let her discover a line that had already been crossed. Right before we ate, my property manager texted to say that Megan's assistant had confirmed receipt of the updated insurance requirements and would be sending a new certificate by the end of the day. And I smiled at the timing because it reminded me that consequences do not need fanfare, they need follow-through, and as we sat down I felt that steady feeling again. The one that comes when your plan is not a fantasy, but a checklist with most boxes already marked, and I knew that whatever happened at that table, I would not have to defend myself with stories or promises, because the building would keep telling the truth all by itself every time rent cleared. Here is the part that might surprise you, and I will be honest about it, because pretending otherwise would make this sound like a fable. I had a flicker of doubt as we passed the bowls and traded the usual family pleasantries. A small voice that asked whether I had turned a sibling rivalry into a business move that would make holidays tougher than they had to be, and in that moment I almost reached for a graceful exit, some gentle sentence about new opportunities and clean slates and how none of this meant anything personal, and then Megan cleared her throat and locked eyes on me, and with that sugar she saves for her favorite put-down said, "Congrats on your little hobby," again, as if repetition would make it true. And I watched my grandfather set his fork down in a slow, deliberate way that always means he is about to cut through the nonsense, and I breathed in once and decided to let him have the floor, because some truths land harder when someone else tells them, and some payoffs are stronger when you do not deliver them yourself. When my grandfather set down his fork like a gavel and said, "Funny, that hobby just bought her company's office building," the room did what rooms do when a story changes in a single breath, which is to go still in a way that makes every stray sound feel like a confession. And I felt every person at that table try to reconcile the version of me they had been carrying around for years with the version that was suddenly attached to contracts and bank wires and a building with an elevator that sometimes sticks between floors, and while they were doing that math I kept my eyes on my plate and let the quiet hold, because I have learned that if you rush a moment like that you end up giving the other person an exit. And I wanted the truth to sit in the center of the table where everyone could see it without me translating it into something softer and easier to ignore. Megan tried to laugh, because laughter is a bridge back to the world where she is the authority on who is winning, and when no one crossed that bridge with her she reached for her phone like it might deliver a different reality than the one in front of her. And I watched her thumb move while she pretended to listen to a story about an uncle's fishing trip, and then I saw the flicker I had been waiting for, the moment when her face is not performance, but problem-solving, which I know better than anyone because I have seen it on my own face in bathroom mirrors at midnight, and she said, very calm, "What is he talking about, and I said, "It means what it sounds like," and that was all I gave her at the table. Because anything more would have turned the reveal into a debate, and I was not interested in debating leases over ham and potato salad. We ate like people do after a small explosion, with too much attention to napkins and not enough to conversation, and every few minutes someone would ask a harmless question about recipes or traffic. And then someone else would remember that nothing was harmless anymore because the story had shifted, and I let the afternoon finish itself without a single victory lap, because the win I wanted was not applause. It was a new default where I did not have to defend my work to anyone, and when dessert was cleared, Megan said my name in the tone that means we are going to step outside and perform being civil while we negotiate the terms of a truce that will not hold. And I followed her to the porch because privacy is a kindness even when the talk will not be kind. She started with the accusation people reach for when they feel cornered, which is that I orchestrated this to humiliate her, that I wanted a public scene, that I chose a holiday for maximum damage. And I let her burn through that because storms burn out faster when you do not feed them, and when she finally paused I said that I did not buy a building to hurt her. I bought a building because it fit my criteria. That I kept my name off the surface because mixing family with business requires guardrails, and that the policies she was bumping against were the same ones every other tenant had, and I waited to see whether she wanted facts or a fight, and when she said, "We can relocate," do not think we will not. I said I knew she could and that her lease gave her the right to leave at renewal if she chose, and I added that I had priced the deal to survive that choice, which was the truth and also the boundary, because I will not run a building by begging anyone to stay. She called my stance cold, and maybe it sounded that way, yet I felt calm rather than hard, because the plan I made was built on her independence rather than my control, and I told her that I was not looking for leverage over her life. I was looking for order in mine, and order in a building looks like the same rules for everyone, and if she wanted accommodations we could talk like professionals through the manager about timing or vendor access or minor improvements that made sense for the property long term, but that special treatment born of family ties was off the table because it is a poison masquerading as love, and I saw her swallow that because she knows it is true, even if she hates hearing it from me. She shifted tactics and told me her costs to move would be substantial, that she had a team settled and a client base that liked the address, that the build-out she had done years ago was still functional and not cheap to replicate. And I nodded because I am not a cartoon villain and because acknowledging facts is free, and then I gave her the only offer I had planned, not a discount or a trophy but a clean lane, an addendum prepared by my attorney that locked in service standards, clarified the compliance calendar so there would be no surprises, and added a small rent credit if her team enrolled in auto pay and kept a perfect record for a year, which is the kind of incentive that makes operations smoother for both sides and keeps drama out of the lobby. And I told her I would extend the same option to any tenant who wanted it because fairness is easier to defend than favors. She asked for my word that no one at the table would hear the details from me, and I told her she would not hear anything from me beyond what the lease required, and I meant it, because the real revenge I wanted was not a family audience. It was a new foundation where my value did not need to be argued, and when she said she would have her CFO review the addendum I said to send comments through the manager by midweek because the sprinkler tests were scheduled and I did not intend to move them. And yes, that line had a little edge in it, and yes, I enjoyed placing it, because discipline that looks petty to a person used to exceptions is often just the shock of meeting a rule for the first time. We went back inside and did the thing families do, which is to pretend we had talked about something nostalgic and sweet, and I hugged my grandfather a little too long, and he whispered that I had handled it with more grace than he had at my age, and that he was proud in the quiet way that matters, and before I left I handed him an envelope that was not for Megan and not for show, a simple letter from a small nonprofit I had funded with a slice of my first quarter cash flow, a scholarship in his name for women starting what people like to call hobbies, small grants for first licenses or basic tools, or the classes that make a person dangerous in the best way, and I told him that was my way of closing the loop. That no matter how the building story played out, something would outlast the drama and turn into a pattern of help. A few days later the addendum came back signed with one minor tweak that made sense. Auto pay was enabled, the certificates arrived clean, the sprinkler test passed, and the late fee policy stopped being a debate and became a calendar entry. And every month since then the wire hits the account with the same tidy memo that used to make me flinch with old feelings and now makes me exhale, and Megan and I speak like grown women who have learned the hard way that boundaries are not punishments. They're architecture, and while there is still a sliver of her that would love to buy the building just to reverse the story, she knows, and I know that she does not need to do that to stand on her own. And if she ever asks to see the books for a purchase conversation, I will treat her like any buyer, which is to say with respect, detail, and the same rules I gave myself. I did not win because I trapped her, I won because I built something that did not require her to shrink for me to feel tall, and that is the part people miss when they fantasize about revenge. They want fireworks and I wanted structure. They want a confession, and I wanted a contract that ends arguments before they start, and if there is any lingering conflict it is the quiet kind that lives in memory rather than in policy, which is fine because memory is not my jurisdiction anymore. The building is, and every month it votes for the version of me I chose when I stopped asking for permission and started signing my own name in the places that matter. Even if that name sits one layer beneath the surface where only people who do the work ever bother to look.